At 11:43 on a bitterly cold Tuesday night in Westchester County, New York, Rachel Bennett stood barefoot on the marble steps of the house she had called home for 7 years. Her 8-month-old daughter was crying against her chest. A diaper bag hung heavily from Rachel's shoulder. One small suitcase sat beside her feet. She had not even been given enough time to pack properly. Inside were 2 dresses, 3 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a few pieces of underwear, Sophie's pajamas, a handful of diapers, and whatever Rachel had been able to grab while her husband stood in the bedroom doorway telling her to hurry. Rachel pulled the thin knitted blanket higher around Sophie's body. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and the cold stone beneath Rachel's bare feet felt almost numb. Behind the enormous glass doors of the house, her husband was speaking to a locksmith. Rachel stared through the glass. She could see Daniel laughing about something. Laughing. 7 years of marriage, and he was laughing while someone changed the locks on the home they had shared. Rachel knocked. Daniel. He didn't look at her. She knocked harder. Daniel, please. Sophie cried louder. Rachel kissed the baby's forehead. It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here. But Rachel wasn't sure anything was okay. She had $37 in her purse. The joint credit card Daniel had given her stopped working earlier that evening. Her own savings had slowly disappeared after she left her job when Sophie was born. Her mother had died 4 years earlier. Her younger sister lived nearly 3,000 miles away in Oregon, and the man inside that house knew every one of those things. Finally, Daniel walked toward the door. He opened it only a few inches. Rachel stared at him. He still wore the expensive white shirt he had worn to work that morning. The sleeves were rolled neatly to his elbows. His hair was perfect. His face showed irritation rather than guilt. Rachel could hardly believe this was the same man who once cried while saying his wedding vows. Please let me get Sophie's winter blanket, Rachel said. The pink one is upstairs. You already have a blanket. This one is thin. Rachel, I'm not doing this all night. She stared at him. She's your daughter. I know that. Then look at her. Daniel glanced at Sophie for less than a second. The baby was crying so hard her cheeks had turned bright red. Let me come inside until I figure out where we're going. No. The answer came immediately. Something inside Rachel went still. Not broken. Not yet. Just still. Daniel, it's almost midnight. I told you earlier that you needed to make arrangements. You told me at 9:30 that you wanted me out. You've had more than 2 hours. Rachel stared at him. 2 hours? Daniel sighed. Please don't start. Don't start? Rachel's voice cracked. I'm outside my own home with your baby in my arms and no shoes on, and you're telling me not to start? Daniel glanced toward the neighboring estate as though the worst thing happening was the possibility someone might hear. Lower your voice. And then Rachel saw movement behind him. Someone was standing near the staircase. A woman. At first, Rachel couldn't understand what she was seeing. Then the woman stepped into the light. Young, beautiful, long dark hair, bare feet, and wrapped around her body was a cream silk robe Rachel recognized instantly. Rachel had bought that robe in Chicago on her 5th wedding anniversary. Her stomach turned. The woman wearing it was Vanessa Cole, Daniel's executive assistant. Vanessa froze when she realized Rachel had seen her. Rachel looked at Vanessa, then Daniel. Then Vanessa again. And suddenly, every unexplained business trip made sense. Every late meeting, every phone call Daniel took outside, every time he turned his phone face down on the table, every night he claimed he was too tired to talk. Rachel looked at her husband. How long? Daniel rubbed his forehead. Rachel, how long? Tonight isn't the time. She's wearing my robe. Vanessa disappeared upstairs. Rachel almost laughed. Not because anything was funny. Sometimes pain becomes so unbelievable that the body doesn't know what else to do. How long have you been sleeping with her? Daniel stepped outside and pulled the door almost closed behind him. You're going to wake the neighbors. I don't care about the neighbors. Well, I do. Of course you do. Rachel stared at him. You care about everybody except the woman you promised to love. Daniel's jaw tightened. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Rachel blinked. What? The drama. The drama? Everything becomes emotional with you. Rachel looked down at the baby in her arms. Your mistress is standing in my house wearing my clothes while you're throwing me and your daughter outside in the middle of the night. What emotion would you prefer? Daniel looked away. That was when Rachel understood something she had been refusing to admit for months. Her husband wasn't confused. He wasn't going through a phase. He wasn't struggling to communicate. He simply no longer cared enough about her pain to be inconvenienced by it. Daniel folded his arms. My attorney will contact you tomorrow. Your attorney? About the divorce. The word seemed to change the temperature around them. Divorce. Rachel knew their marriage was struggling, but she thought they were struggling together. She had suggested counseling. Daniel said he was too busy. She had asked him to spend one weekend away with her. He claimed there was an investor meeting. She had tried to talk to him after Sophie was born about how lonely she felt. Daniel kissed her forehead and told her she was probably exhausted. Rachel kept believing there was something left to save. Apparently Daniel had already buried it. What about Sophie? I'll provide for her. She needs more than money. Don't lecture me about my daughter. Then act like her father. Daniel's expression hardened. I am her father. When was the last time you gave her a bath? He said nothing. When was the last time you woke up when she cried? Nothing. When was the last time you took her to the pediatrician? Daniel looked away. Rachel nodded slowly. Exactly. I work. So did I. That was your choice. Rachel felt as if he had slapped her. My choice? You wanted to stay home. You asked me to. I didn't force you. You said Sophie deserved to have one parent home. You said your salary was more than enough. You told me we were building a family. Daniel shrugged. Things change. 3 words. Things change. 7 years reduced to 3 words. Rachel looked past him into the foyer. She had chosen the curtains hanging beside the tall windows. She had picked the warm cream paint because Daniel said the original gray made the place feel like a hotel. She had planted the roses herself. She had spent 3 weeks preparing Sophie's nursery while heavily pregnant because Daniel had been traveling. Every corner held a piece of her. But suddenly none of it belonged to her. Where am I supposed to go? You have friends. My closest friend has 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment. Get a hotel. My card was declined. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told Rachel everything. You canceled it. It was connected to my account. I'm your wife. Not for much longer. Rachel closed her eyes. Sophie whimpered. My mother is dead. My sister is in Oregon. I haven't worked since Sophie was born, you know that. Daniel looked toward the door. You'll figure it out. Those words stayed with Rachel. You'll figure it out. Not we will figure it out. Not let me make sure Sophie is safe. Not, I'm sorry. You'll figure it out. Daniel reached into his pocket. He pulled out 2 $100 bills. He placed them on top of Rachel's suitcase. For a hotel. Rachel stared at the money. Then she looked at the man she once believed would grow old beside her. Something inside her changed. She bent down, picked up both bills. Daniel seemed relieved. Rachel folded them carefully. Then she stepped toward him and slipped them into the pocket of his expensive shirt. Keep it. Rachel, I said keep it. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not. Then take the money. No. What are you trying to prove? Rachel looked directly into his eyes. That there are still some things I own. Daniel frowned. My dignity is one of them. Rachel lifted the suitcase. She turned toward the driveway. Rachel. She stopped. For one foolish second, hope returned. Maybe he would tell her to come back inside. Maybe seeing her walk away with their baby would awaken something in him. Maybe 7 years mattered after all. Daniel spoke. My lawyer will call you in the morning. Rachel didn't turn around. She walked away. Daniel closed the door. He had no idea that less than 48 hours later, a lawyer would open a sealed envelope in a conference room overlooking Manhattan. He had no idea his father had been keeping a secret, and he certainly had no idea that the woman he had just thrown into the cold with his infant daughter was about to inherit the one thing Daniel had spent his entire life believing belonged to him. Everything. And before we go further, if you've ever had someone underestimate you, betray you, or make you feel like losing them meant losing your whole life, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the Tale Vault. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, because I love seeing how far these stories travel. But remember Rachel standing barefoot on those steps with a baby against her chest, because before this story ends, the man who told her she would have to figure it out is going to discover that his father had already figured out exactly who Daniel was. Rachel met Arthur Bennett 9 years earlier. Everyone in New York business circles knew his name. Arthur Bennett was the founder of Bennett Holdings, one of the largest privately controlled investment groups on the East Coast. His company owned luxury hotels in New York, Florida, Texas, California, and Georgia. It held major interests in commercial real estate, logistics, healthcare, private lending, and technology. Financial magazines estimated Arthur's personal fortune at more than $2.8 billion. Yet the first time Rachel met him, he was standing in his kitchen arguing with a coffee machine. Rachel had been dating Daniel for 3 months. She was terrified about meeting his father. Daniel spent the entire drive to Arthur's estate warning her. "My dad can be difficult." What does difficult mean? He asks questions. Parents ask questions. No, my father interrogates people. Rachel laughed nervously. What should I say? Just don't try too hard. That advice became unnecessary the moment Rachel walked into Arthur's kitchen. The billionaire was wearing old gray sweatpants and glaring at an espresso machine. "Daniel, why does this thing have 14 buttons?" Daniel sighed. "Dad, this is Rachel." Arthur looked at her. Rachel smiled. "Hello, Mr. Bennett." Arthur pointed at the coffee machine. "Do you know how this works?" Rachel examined it. "No." "Excellent." Daniel frowned. Arthur smiled. Finally, an honest person. That was their beginning. Arthur didn't ask Rachel about her family connections. He didn't care whether she knew the right people. He asked what she did for work. Rachel told him she worked in community development for a nonprofit organization in Brooklyn. "What does that mean?" "It means I spend most of my day trying to convince wealthy people that affordable housing isn't going to destroy civilization." Arthur laughed so loudly Daniel looked embarrassed. At dinner, Arthur asked Rachel what she thought of one of Bennett Holdings' projects in Queens. Daniel attempted to change the subject. Rachel answered honestly. "I think the project is beautiful." Arthur smiled. "But," Rachel hesitated, "but the people who already live there probably won't be able to afford it." Daniel gave her a warning look. Arthur leaned forward. "Go on." Rachel explained that development could improve neighborhoods without removing the families who had already built communities there. Arthur listened. He disagreed with part of what she said. Rachel disagreed right back. Later that evening after she left, Arthur told Daniel, "Don't ruin that woman." Daniel laughed. "I'm serious. You've known her 3 hours. That's 2 hours and 50 minutes longer than I needed." Daniel shook his head. "You like everybody who disagrees with me." "No, I like people who aren't afraid of you." Rachel and Daniel married 2 years later. Arthur attended the wedding alone. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, had died from cancer when Daniel was 19. Arthur never remarried. For all his wealth, the old man lived a surprisingly lonely life. His employees respected him. Business partners feared him. Daniel loved him in the complicated way some sons love fathers whose approval they can never quite earn. But Rachel saw something else. She saw a widower who still kept Eleanor's reading glasses in the drawer beside his bed. She saw a man who pretended not to care about birthdays but remembered everyone else's. She saw someone surrounded by employees but starved for family. 3 years into Rachel's marriage, Arthur suffered a stroke. It wasn't catastrophic. He could still speak. He could still walk with assistance. But his right hand became weak, and for several months he needed help with ordinary tasks. Daniel visited the hospital on the first day. He returned 2 days later. Then work became busy. Rachel went every afternoon. At first Arthur complained. "You have a job." "I know." "Then go to it." "I already went." "You don't have to sit here." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Rachel opened the container of soup she'd brought. "Because hospital food is terrible." Arthur smiled despite himself. During rehabilitation, Rachel drove him to appointments. She organized his medication. She learned the exercises his physical therapist recommended. When Arthur refused to practice, Rachel refused to leave. One afternoon he became so frustrated that he threw a rubber therapy ball across the room. "I can't do it." Rachel picked it up. Arthur looked away. "Aren't you going to tell me everything will be fine?" "No." He looked at her. "I don't know if everything will be fine." Arthur frowned. Rachel sat beside him. "But I'll sit here until you're ready to try again." Arthur stared at her for several seconds. Then he held out his hand. "Give me the ball." Rachel smiled. Arthur never forgot that afternoon. Neither did Evelyn Price, his longtime housekeeper. Mrs. Price had worked for Arthur for 26 years. She had watched wealthy relatives appear whenever Arthur was sick and disappear whenever he recovered. Rachel was different. She never asked about the will. Never asked about money. Never asked Arthur to invest in anything. Never asked him to help Daniel get promoted. When Arthur offered to pay off Rachel's student loans, she refused. Why? Because they're mine. "I have more money than I know what to do with." "Then give it to someone who needs it." Arthur laughed. "You're stubborn." "So are you." "I earned the right." "So did I." Arthur loved her for that. Daniel didn't understand their relationship. One evening, Rachel came home after taking Arthur to physical therapy. Daniel sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. "How's Dad?" "Better." "Good." Rachel opened the refrigerator. Daniel looked at her. "You know he has nurses." "I know." "You don't have to keep babysitting him." Rachel turned around. "Your father had a stroke. And he has the best medical care money can buy. He needs family." Daniel laughed. "My father doesn't need anybody." Rachel looked at him. "Everybody needs somebody." Daniel returned to his phone. That conversation remained in Rachel's mind for years. Then Sophie was born. Arthur changed the first time he held his granddaughter. Rachel had never seen him nervous before. But when the nurse placed Sophie in his arms, Arthur looked terrified. "Her head." Rachel laughed. "Support it." "I'm supporting it. You look like you're holding a bomb." "She's smaller than a football. Please don't compare my daughter to sporting equipment." Arthur smiled. Then Sophie opened her eyes. Arthur went silent. His eyes filled with tears. Daniel laughed. "Dad, are you crying?" Arthur ignored him. Rachel put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You can love her as much as you want." Arthur looked at Rachel strangely. "What?" "Nothing." But he remembered. As Sophie grew, Arthur visited constantly. Every Wednesday he called Rachel. "What did she do today?" "She sneezed." "How many times?" "Arthur, I'm asking a question." 3. "Interesting." "Why is that interesting?" "She's advanced." Rachel laughed. "At sneezing?" "My granddaughter is advanced at everything." Arthur bought Sophie ridiculous gifts. Rachel repeatedly asked him to stop. One afternoon he arrived with a miniature electric car. Rachel stood in the driveway staring at it. "She's 6 months old. She'll grow." "Arthur, it's safe. She can't even sit properly in it yet. Eventually." "You are impossible." He grinned. What Rachel didn't know was that during those same months, Arthur had begun watching Daniel much more closely. Arthur had always known his son loved money. What frightened him was realizing Daniel had begun believing wealth exempted him from consequences. Daniel had risen quickly through Bennett Holdings. Some employees believed it was because he was talented. Others knew his last name helped. Arthur deliberately refused to make him chief executive. Daniel resented it. "You've trained me for this my entire life." Arthur looked at him across his desk. "I trained you to become capable of it. What's the difference?" "Character." Daniel laughed. "You don't run a corporation on character." Arthur's expression changed. "That's exactly what you run it on." Daniel walked out furious. Months later, Arthur discovered company aircraft had been used for Daniel's personal trips. Then he discovered an apartment in Manhattan being paid through a corporate subsidiary. Daniel claimed it was used for visiting executives. Arthur's private investigator discovered Vanessa had been staying there. Arthur said nothing. He began documenting everything. He met privately with Jonathan Hale, the attorney who had represented him for 30 years. He changed his will, then changed it again. He underwent independent medical evaluations, so no one could later claim he lacked capacity. He recorded video statements. He established trusts. And one rainy afternoon, he wrote Rachel a letter. But that wasn't the only thing Arthur discovered. 6 months before his death, Arthur received an anonymous packet. Inside were copies of emails between Daniel and an executive at a rival investment group called Hawthorne Capital. The emails referred to something called Project Lantern. Arthur first assumed it was an ordinary acquisition. Then he found a document that made his blood run cold. Daniel had been exploring the possibility of selling a major Bennett Holdings logistics division without board approval. The division employed nearly 12,000 people. It had also been built by Arthur and Eleanor during the early years of their marriage. It was one of the few assets Arthur had sworn he would never sell. But the proposed sale wasn't the most disturbing part. The emails suggested Daniel intended to push the deal through immediately after Arthur's death. Arthur sat alone in his study reading the documents twice. Then he called Marcus Reed. "Do you know anything about Project Lantern?" Marcus frowned. "No." "Find out." Within 3 weeks, Marcus uncovered enough to make Arthur physically ill. Daniel had quietly promised Hawthorne Capital that he would deliver controlling access to the logistics division once he inherited Bennett Holdings. In exchange, Daniel stood to receive a personal compensation package worth more than $80 million. He was effectively planning to sell a piece of his father's company for personal gain before the old man was even dead. Arthur confronted him indirectly. One evening over dinner, he asked, "If you inherited the company tomorrow, what's the first thing you'd change?" Daniel smiled. "Depends. On what?" "Market conditions." "Would you sell Bennett Logistics?" Daniel looked at him. "Why?" "Answer." Daniel shrugged. "If the price were right." Arthur stared at his son. "Your mother built that company beside me. We can't run a corporation based on sentiment." "No." Arthur's voice went quiet. "We run it based on judgment." Daniel didn't know Arthur already knew. Arthur made the final revision to his will the next morning. But Arthur still wasn't satisfied. He needed to know whether Rachel was what he believed she was. So he did something Rachel would not discover until much later. He tested her. Arthur arranged for one of his longtime friends, an attorney named Samuel Brooks, to approach Rachel with what appeared to be an investment opportunity. The company needed $200,000 to keep a housing project alive. Samuel casually mentioned that Arthur would probably invest if Rachel asked. Rachel listened. Then she shook her head. "I won't ask him." Samuel frowned. "Why not?" "Because Arthur is generous with me." So that means I should be more careful, not less. What if the project fails? Then we'll find another investor. You could solve it with one phone call. Rachel smiled. Exactly, which is why I won't. Samuel reported every word to Arthur. Arthur never tested her again. On the morning after Daniel threw Rachel out, she woke in a cheap hotel near LaGuardia Airport. Sophie slept beside her. Rachel had barely rested. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vanessa standing on the staircase wearing her robe. She saw Daniel placing money on her suitcase. She heard him saying, "You'll figure it out." Her phone contained 17 missed calls. None were from Daniel. Most came from an unfamiliar Manhattan number. At 6:40 in the morning, the number called again. Rachel answered. "Hello? Mrs. Bennett?" "Yes." "My name is Jonathan Hale. I'm Arthur Bennett's attorney." Rachel sat upright. "Is Arthur okay?" Silence. Her stomach tightened. "Mr. Hale? I'm afraid Mr. Bennett passed away yesterday evening." Rachel stopped breathing. "No. I'm very sorry." "No, I spoke to him Sunday." "I know. He was fine. He suffered an aortic rupture. It happened very quickly." Rachel pressed her hand over her mouth. The tears came instantly. Arthur. Gone. The man who kept strawberry candies in every desk drawer. The man who called Sophie Chairwoman Bennett. the man who had become the closest thing Rachel had to a father after her mother died. Gone. Rachel cried quietly because she didn't want to wake the baby. Jonathan waited. Finally, Rachel whispered, "Was he alone?" "No, Mrs. Price was with him." "Did he suffer?" "Not for long." Rachel closed her eyes. "Thank God." Jonathan waited another moment. "Mrs. Bennett, there's another reason I'm calling." Rachel wiped her face. "What?" "Mr. Bennett left instructions concerning you." "Me?" "I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning." "Why?" "I'd rather discuss that in person." Rachel looked around the hotel room. "Mr. Hale, Daniel threw me out last night." Silence. "What did you say?" Rachel regretted mentioning it. "Nothing. Did Daniel remove you and Sophie from the marital residence?" Rachel looked at her daughter. "Yes. Where are you?" "A hotel." "Does Daniel know?" "He doesn't care." Jonathan's voice changed. "Mrs. Bennett, listen very carefully. Do not sign anything Daniel or his attorneys send you." Rachel frowned. "Why?" "I can't discuss everything over the telephone." "Mr. Hale, tomorrow at 10. What's happening?" Another pause. "Bring identification." Rachel stared at the phone after the call ended. But Daniel's lawyer called first. At 8:15 that morning, a woman named Cynthia Blake introduced herself. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm calling on behalf of your husband." Rachel almost laughed at the word husband. "Okay. Mr. Bennett would like to resolve the separation privately." "Privately?" "Yes." "What does that mean?" "He's willing to provide immediate financial support in exchange for a temporary agreement." Rachel's instincts sharpened. "What agreement?" "We can send it electronically." "Tell me what it says." There was a pause. "It would establish interim custody and confirm that you voluntarily vacated the marital residence." Rachel's expression changed. "I did not voluntarily leave. It's simply standard language." "No. Mrs. Bennett, Daniel is prepared to transfer $100,000 to an account in your name today." Rachel stared at the wall. $100,000. Yesterday he offered 200. Now 100,000. Why? I'm sorry? Why is he suddenly offering me that much? It's in everyone's best interest to avoid conflict. Rachel remembered Jonathan's warning. "Do not sign anything." "No." "Would you like time to consider?" "I've considered it." "Mrs. Bennett, I would strongly advise you to speak with counsel before rejecting a generous proposal." Rachel's voice stayed calm. "I'll do exactly that." She ended the call. The next morning, Rachel arrived at Jonathan Hale's office wearing the only black dress she had packed. Her friend Claire watched Sophie downstairs. Daniel arrived 17 minutes late. Vanessa came with him. Rachel couldn't believe it. Arthur had been dead less than 2 days, and Daniel brought his mistress to the reading of his father's will. Vanessa wore a conservative black dress and avoided Rachel's eyes. Daniel looked irritated when he saw his wife. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan answered before Rachel could. "Your father requested her presence." Daniel frowned. "My father requested a lot of things." Several people sat around the conference table. Marcus Reed, Arthur's longtime chief financial officer, Mrs. Price, 2 trustees, 3 attorneys, and one man Rachel had never seen before. He appeared to be in his late 60s and sat silently near the window. Jonathan began reading. Arthur left generous gifts to employees, scholarships to universities, millions to charities. Mrs. Price received the home Arthur had purchased for her years earlier and $2 million. She covered her face and cried. Then Jonathan reached the controlling assets. Daniel straightened. Everyone knew what he expected. Jonathan adjusted his glasses. "To my son, Daniel Arthur Bennett, I leave the sum of $5 million, subject to the conditions contained in the accompanying trust documents." Daniel's face changed. "What?" Jonathan continued. "I have given my son every advantage a father could provide. What I could not give him was character. Perhaps life still can." Daniel pushed back his chair. "This is ridiculous." "Sit down," Marcus said quietly. Daniel ignored him. $5 million? Jonathan looked at him. "Yes. My father was worth billions." "Correct. So where is everything else? Jonathan looked down. Rachel suddenly felt uneasy. To my daughter-in-law, Rachel Elise Bennett, I leave the remainder of my personal estate, including my controlling interest in Bennett Holdings, my residential properties, investment portfolio and family trust interests, subject to the stewardship provisions established for my granddaughter, Sophie Eleanor Bennett. Silence. Rachel blinked. She was certain she had misunderstood. I'm sorry. What? Jonathan looked at her. Arthur left the remainder of his estate to you. Rachel shook her head. No. Daniel laughed. It was a sharp, disbelieving sound. No. Jonathan remained calm. Rachel receives 52% of the voting shares of Bennett Holdings. Daniel stood. That's my company. Marcus looked at him. It was your father's. And now? Marcus turned toward Rachel. Now it belongs to her. Rachel couldn't move. Numbers meant nothing. Billions meant nothing. All she could think about was Arthur sitting in his kitchen fighting with a coffee machine. Why? Jonathan removed an envelope. He explained that. The envelope had Rachel's name written across it in Arthur's handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. Rachel, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are probably angry with me for leaving you a responsibility you never asked for. Blood made Daniel my son. Love made you my daughter. I have spent my life around people who were kind when they wanted something. You were kind to me when you believed I had nothing you needed. You sat beside me when my hand would not move. You told me the truth when lying would have been easier. You loved my granddaughter without treating her as an extension of the Bennett name. I am not leaving you wealth as a reward. I am leaving you responsibility because I trust what you will do with it. Protect Sophie. Protect the people who built this company. Never confuse wealth with worth. And never let money convince you to stay where love has already left. Rachel couldn't see the page anymore. Tears blurred the words. Across the table, Daniel stared at her. Then his face hardened. You knew. Rachel looked up. What? You knew. I didn't. You manipulated him. Rachel stared at her husband. Daniel pointed toward the letter. All those hospital visits. All those dinners. You knew exactly what you were doing. Rachel stood slowly. I loved your father. You wanted his money. Rachel's grief turned colder. Last night you put $200 on my suitcase. Daniel froze. Everyone in the room became silent. Rachel continued. You knew I had nowhere to go. You knew I had our daughter in my arms. You knew I hadn't worked since Sophie was born. And you gave me $200 and locked the door. Daniel looked around the room. This is private. Rachel almost smiled. It stopped being private when you accused me of marrying you for money. She picked up Arthur's letter. If I wanted your money so badly, Daniel, why didn't I take the $200? No one spoke. But before Rachel could leave, the unfamiliar older man near the window finally stood. There's another matter. Everyone looked at him. Jonathan nodded. Rachel, this is Samuel Brooks. Rachel frowned. Samuel approached. We've met before. I don't think we have. Not under my real name. Rachel stared at him. Then recognition slowly appeared. You were the consultant from the housing project. Samuel nodded. Daniel looked confused. What is this? Samuel turned toward him. Your father wanted to know whether Rachel would use her relationship with him for financial advantage. Rachel's face changed. What? He asked me to test her. Rachel looked at Jonathan. Arthur tested me? Jonathan looked uncomfortable. Once, Samuel said, you refused to ask Arthur for money, even when doing so would have solved the problem immediately. Rachel didn't know whether to be hurt or amused. Daniel scoffed. So this is what we're doing now? Turning her into a saint? Samuel looked at him. No, your father wasn't looking for a saint. He paused. He was looking for someone he could trust. Then Jonathan spoke. There is one more provision. Daniel looked ready to explode. Jonathan picked up another document. Arthur created a separate conditional trust containing an additional 20% voting interest in Bennett Holdings. Rachel frowned. I thought you said I have 52%. You do. Then what's the 20%? It is currently held by the trust. For whom? Jonathan looked at Daniel. Potentially you. Daniel went still. The room changed. Jonathan continued. Your father created a path by which you may earn stewardship rights over those shares. Daniel slowly sat down. What do I have to do? Jonathan read. You must remain employed within Bennett Holdings for 5 continuous years, without executive title, without disciplinary action for financial misconduct, and without attempting to challenge Rachel's controlling interest. Daniel stared at him. 5 years? Yes. And then I get 20%? You become eligible for consideration by the Independent Trust Committee. Daniel laughed bitterly. So not even guaranteed? No. What kind of sick game is this? Jonathan closed the folder. The kind your father apparently believed you needed. Daniel challenged the will within 48 hours anyway. His lawyers claimed Arthur had been mentally incompetent. They claimed Rachel exercised undue influence. They described her as financially dependent. Jonathan had expected every argument. Arthur had expected them first. 6 months before his death, he had undergone 2 independent competency evaluations. Both declared him mentally sound. The will had been witnessed. Every major revision was documented. And Arthur had recorded a video. Daniel watched it in Jonathan's office. Arthur sat behind his desk looking directly into the camera. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am making this statement voluntarily and with full understanding of my estate. He explained his decision. Then he paused. If Daniel is watching this because he challenged my will, apparently I knew my son better than he knew me. Daniel's attorney looked at him. Daniel said nothing. 3 weeks later, he withdrew the challenge. But he didn't do it because he had accepted defeat. He did it because Cynthia Blake discovered the challenge itself might violate the conditions of Arthur's trust. If Daniel continued, he could permanently lose any chance at the additional voting shares. That was Arthur's first trap. The second came from Marcus. When Rachel became controlling shareholder, Marcus requested a private meeting. He placed several folders in front of her. Arthur was investigating Daniel. Rachel frowned. For what? Unauthorized expenditures. Rachel opened the first folder. Company aircraft. Luxury hotels. Private vacations charged as corporate travel. A Manhattan apartment billed through a subsidiary. Payments to Vanessa disguised as consulting fees. Rachel's stomach turned. How much? Enough to matter. Did Arthur know? Almost all of it. Rachel leaned back. Why didn't he fire him? Marcus looked at her. Because he was his son. Rachel understood that kind of weakness. She had spent years forgiving Daniel because he was her husband. Love could make intelligent people tolerate what they would never advise someone else to tolerate. Marcus pushed another folder toward her. This is worse. Rachel opened it. Project Lantern. What am I looking at? A proposed sale. Of what? Bennett Logistics. Rachel looked up. Arthur's first company? Technically his second, but the one he built with Eleanor. Daniel wanted to sell it? Marcus nodded. Without board approval. Can he do that? Not legally. Rachel kept reading. Then she found the compensation section. $82 million. Rachel looked up. That goes to Daniel? Through several entities. Rachel stared at the paper. He was going to sell part of his father's company after Arthur died and pay himself $80 million. Marcus nodded. Rachel sat back. For the first time since the will reading, she felt something beyond grief and shock. Fear. Because Daniel had not merely been spoiled. He had been planning. Does Hawthorne Capital know Arthur discovered this? I don't think so. Then don't tell them. Marcus looked surprised. Rachel closed the folder. I want to know how far this goes. That decision revealed the first major twist. 3 weeks later, Marcus entered Rachel's office holding a flash drive. We have a problem. Rachel looked up. How big? Very. He closed the door. Someone inside Bennett Holdings had continued communicating with Hawthorne Capital even after Arthur's death. Rachel assumed it was Daniel. It wasn't. The emails came from the account of Robert Keller, Bennett Holdings Executive Vice President of Operations. Robert had worked for Arthur for 20 years. He was one of the people Rachel had believed she could trust. Why would Robert do this? Marcus shook his head. We don't know. When confronted privately, Robert denied everything. My account was compromised. Rachel watched him. Are you saying someone used your email? Yes. Who? I don't know. Marcus slid a printed message across the table. The message referred to Rachel as temporary. Robert's face went pale. I didn't write that. Rachel believed him. She didn't know why, but something about his fear was different from Daniel's arrogance. Rachel asked the IT department to conduct a forensic review. 2 days later, they discovered someone had remotely accessed Robert's account using administrator credentials. The credentials belonged to Vanessa. Rachel stared at the report. Vanessa still has system access? She shouldn't. Shouldn't? Marcus looked furious. Daniel requested that her credentials remain active after she left the company. Rachel's stomach tightened. Daniel had told everyone Vanessa left him. What if that wasn't true? Rachel hired a private investigator. The report came back 10 days later. Daniel and Vanessa were still meeting. Not romantically. At least not obviously. They met twice at a hotel lounge in Midtown. Once at an attorney's office. And once with a representative from Hawthorne Capital. Rachel realized the affair had never been the whole story. Vanessa wasn't simply Daniel's mistress. She was involved in Project Lantern. Arthur knew about her relationship with Daniel, but he may not have known how deep her involvement went. Rachel faced a choice. Confront Daniel immediately. Or wait. She waited. For the first time in her life, Rachel began understanding the kind of patience Arthur had used in business. Not passivity. Patience. The ability to let someone reveal themselves. Meanwhile, Daniel's public life was collapsing. Business magazines reported the unexpected inheritance. Headlines spread across financial media. Billionaire leaves empire to daughter-in-law. Son receives $5 million. Questions surround surprise succession. Daniel hated every article. He especially hated the photographs of Rachel entering Bennett Holdings. He began telling friends she had manipulated Arthur. Some believed him. Others didn't. One evening, Daniel appeared at Rachel's temporary apartment. She opened the door but didn't invite him inside. I miss Sophie. You can see her according to the custody schedule. I miss you. Rachel said nothing. I made a mistake. You made choices. I wasn't thinking. You were thinking clearly enough to call a locksmith. Daniel looked down. Vanessa is gone. Rachel studied him. Is she? Daniel's eyes flickered. It lasted less than a second. But Rachel saw it. What does that mean? Rachel smiled faintly. Nothing. I want my family back. Do you? Yes. Or do you want your company back? Daniel's jaw tightened. You're enjoying this. Rachel's expression changed. You think I enjoy knowing the man I loved spent months sleeping with someone else while planning to sell his father's company? Daniel froze. Rachel saw it. Pure shock. You know, I know enough. Daniel looked toward the hallway. Rachel, you don't understand what's happening. Then explain it. I can't. Can't or won't. Daniel lowered his voice. Hawthorne isn't what you think. What is it? Daniel looked at her. For a moment, Rachel thought he might tell her everything. Instead, he stepped back. Be careful who you trust. Rachel almost laughed. You don't get to warn me about trust. I'm serious. So am I. Daniel walked away. That conversation disturbed Rachel more than she wanted to admit. She told Marcus. Marcus frowned. What if he's trying to scare you? Then it worked. Marcus leaned back. Or what if there really is something else? There was. A week later, Jonathan called Rachel to his office. He looked troubled. Arthur left another document. Rachel stared at him. How many surprises did that man plan? Jonathan almost smiled. This one wasn't supposed to be opened unless specific conditions occurred. What conditions? A challenge to the will, evidence of continued contact between Daniel and Hawthorne Capital, or an attempt to sell Bennett Logistics. Rachel sat down. All three. Jonathan nodded. He opened a safe. Inside was a sealed black envelope. Across the front, Arthur had written one sentence. Rachel, if this has been opened, Daniel is in more danger than he realizes. Rachel's chest tightened. She opened it. The letter was shorter than the others. Daniel believes he found Hawthorne. He did not. Hawthorne found Daniel. They approached him knowing his weaknesses. Vanity. Impatience. Resentment. But I do not believe their true objective is Bennett Logistics. I believe they want Bennett Holdings itself. If I am right, Project Lantern is bait. Do not assume Daniel understands the game he is playing. He may be guilty. He may also be useful to people far more dangerous than he is. Trust Marcus. Trust Jonathan. And find Eleanor's blue ledger. Rachel stared at the final sentence. Eleanor's blue ledger? Jonathan shook his head. I've never heard of it. Neither had Marcus. Mrs. Price had. When Rachel asked her, the older woman became very still. Where did you hear that? Arthur. Mrs. Price sat down. Eleanor kept a blue notebook when they were first building the company. What was in it? Everything. Everything meaning. People they borrowed from. Early investors. Private agreements. Names Arthur didn't like discussing. Where is it? I thought Arthur destroyed it after Eleanor died. Rachel's pulse quickened. What if he didn't? They searched Arthur's study. Nothing. His private office. Nothing. The family safe. Nothing. Then Mrs. Price remembered something. Eleanor had a reading room in the old country house. What country house? The one in Vermont. Rachel had never heard of it. Arthur owned properties everywhere. The Vermont house had not been used in years. Rachel, Marcus, and Jonathan flew there the next morning. The property sat beside a frozen lake outside Stowe. Inside, dust covered the furniture. Eleanor's reading room was upstairs. Books lined every wall. Rachel searched shelves, drawers, boxes. Nothing. Hours passed. Marcus finally said, maybe Arthur was wrong. Rachel stared at an old photograph on the desk. Arthur and Eleanor stood beside a maple tree. Behind them was a small wooden boathouse. Rachel looked outside. The same boathouse stood at the edge of the lake. Inside it, beneath a loose floorboard, they found a metal box. Inside was the blue ledger. The entries were more than 30 years old. At first, none of it made sense. Then Marcus found a name. Charles Hawthorne. Rachel looked at him. The Hawthorne? Marcus nodded slowly. Charles Hawthorne was the father of Richard Hawthorne, the current chairman of Hawthorne Capital. The ledger revealed that Charles had secretly financed Bennett Holdings during a near collapse in the early 1990s. In exchange, he received an option to acquire a substantial minority interest if Arthur defaulted on certain obligations. Arthur repaid the debt. But one page was missing. Cleanly removed. Jonathan frowned. What was on this page? Rachel looked at the binding. Someone didn't want us to know. That missing page became the center of everything. 3 days later, Rachel received an anonymous text. Stop looking for the ledger. Her blood turned cold. No one outside 4 people knew they'd found it. Rachel showed Marcus. He immediately ordered security. Jonathan contacted federal investigators quietly because Hawthorne's potential financial misconduct could involve securities laws. Then the next twist arrived. Vanessa contacted Rachel. Not Daniel. Rachel. She requested a private meeting. Rachel refused at first. Vanessa sent a photograph. It showed the missing page from Eleanor's ledger. Rachel agreed to meet. They chose a crowded cafe in Manhattan. Vanessa arrived wearing sunglasses. Rachel almost didn't recognize her. She looked tired, nervous. Not like the smug woman who had stood in Rachel's house wearing her robe. Rachel sat across from her. Give me the page. Vanessa looked around. I can't. Then why am I here? Because Daniel doesn't know what he's involved in. Rachel's patience disappeared. You slept with my husband. Vanessa's face tightened. I know. You stood in my home while he put me outside with my baby. I know. Don't ask me for sympathy. I'm not. Vanessa leaned forward. I'm asking you to understand that the affair started before Hawthorne, but Hawthorne used it. Rachel stared at her. What does that mean? Richard Hawthorne knew about Daniel and me. How? I don't know. He threatened you? Not exactly. Vanessa swallowed. He offered me money. Rachel felt disgust. And you took it. Vanessa nodded. At first. For what? Information. What kind? Daniel's schedule, Arthur's health, internal meetings. Rachel went still. You gave another company information about Arthur's health? Vanessa looked ashamed. I told myself it wasn't confidential. Was it? Yes. Rachel leaned back. Why should I believe anything you say? Because I'm the reason Arthur found out. Rachel stared at her. What? Vanessa took off her sunglasses. I sent him the anonymous packet. Rachel couldn't speak. I was in too deep, Vanessa continued. Hawthorne wanted Daniel to sell Bennett Logistics. Daniel thought that was the deal. It wasn't. What was the deal? Once Bennett Logistics was sold, Hawthorne planned to trigger old financing claims tied to the original Bennett structure. Rachel thought of the blue ledger. The missing page. Vanessa nodded. Richard claims his father never released one of the original options. Is that true? I don't know. Where is the page? With Daniel. Rachel's heart pounded. Daniel took it? No. Hawthorne gave him a copy. Why? To prove they had leverage. Rachel remembered Daniel warning her. Be careful who you trust. Why didn't Daniel tell Arthur? Vanessa laughed bitterly. Because he still thought he could win. Win what? Everything. Daniel believed if he cooperated with Hawthorne long enough, he could turn on them later, preserve the company, and force Arthur to finally see him as capable. Rachel shook her head. That doesn't make sense. It made sense to Daniel. And somehow that did make sense. Daniel had spent his entire life desperate to prove he was smarter than his father. He had entered a dangerous deal, believing he could outplay everyone. Vanessa continued. After Arthur died, Richard told Daniel the deal had changed. Hawthorne wanted more. How much more? Controlling interest in Bennett Holdings. Rachel felt cold. And Daniel? He refused. Rachel stared at her. You're telling me Daniel refused to hand over the company? Yes. Why? Vanessa's expression softened. Because whatever else Daniel is, he does love his father's company. Rachel almost laughed at the absurdity. The same man who planned to sell part of it for $80 million? Vanessa seemed to read her face. He wanted money, power, his father's approval, all of it. But he never intended to lose the entire company. Rachel sat quietly. What does Hawthorne have on him? Enough to send him to prison. Rachel looked up. Vanessa nodded. Emails, agreements, private payments. Rachel understood. Daniel wasn't simply hiding because he wanted the inheritance back. He was trapped. Vanessa slid a flash drive across the table. This is everything I kept. Rachel didn't touch it. Why are you helping me? Vanessa's eyes filled. Because Richard threatened my sister. Rachel stared at her. My sister works at a healthcare company Hawthorne owns. He made it very clear what would happen to her career if I stopped cooperating. And you think I care? No. Vanessa's voice shook. But maybe you care that Arthur was right. About what? Daniel is guilty. She paused. But he's not the biggest danger. Rachel took the flash drive. 2 nights later, Daniel disappeared. His phone went straight to voicemail. He missed a scheduled visit with Sophie. That was what made Rachel panic. Daniel had missed many things in their marriage. But since Arthur's death, he had not missed one scheduled visit with his daughter. Rachel called his attorney. Nothing. She called Marcus. Nothing. Then at 1:18 in the morning, Rachel received a voicemail. Daniel's voice. Rachel, if you get this, don't call me back. Don't trust anyone from Hawthorne. Keep Sophie close. And whatever you do not sign anything related to Bennett Logistics. The message ended. Rachel called Jonathan. By sunrise, security footage showed Daniel entering a parking garage in Manhattan the previous evening. He never drove out. His car remained inside. Police were contacted. Federal investigators became involved. Hawthorne Capital publicly denied any knowledge of Daniel's location. 3 days passed. Rachel barely slept. On the fourth day, Daniel walked into a police precinct in New Jersey, alive, bruised, exhausted, and ready to talk. Rachel did not see him immediately. Federal agents questioned him for nearly 12 hours. When Rachel finally entered the hospital room where he was being examined, Daniel looked smaller than she had ever seen him. His lip was split. One eye was bruised. She stood at the door. Daniel looked at her. "You came. For Sophie." He nodded. "Of course." Rachel remained standing. "What happened?" Daniel looked toward the agent outside. "I tried to give them the ledger page." "Why?" "Because I thought they'd leave you alone." Rachel stared at him. "You had it?" "A copy." "Where is the original?" "I don't know." Daniel closed his eyes. "I was stupid." Rachel said nothing. "I thought I could use Hawthorne. You were planning to sell Bennett Logistics." "Yes. For $80 million. Daniel looked ashamed. "Yes. Your mother's company." "I know. Your father's employees." "I know. Thousands of families." "I know." Rachel's voice shook. "No, Daniel, I don't think you did." He looked at her. "I hated him." Rachel went still. "My father." Daniel swallowed. "I spent my whole life trying to make that man say I was good enough. Every promotion became another test. Every success became another reason I wasn't ready. Hawthorne came along and told me exactly what I wanted to hear. That you were smarter than Arthur." Daniel nodded. "They told me if I pushed the logistics sale through, the stock structure would force Dad to finally step aside." Rachel's face changed. "You wanted to force him out." "I wanted him to need me." That sentence said everything. Daniel hadn't simply wanted money. He wanted control over the man whose approval he could never secure. What changed? "Sophie." Rachel stared at him. Daniel's eyes filled. "The night I threw you out." Rachel's expression hardened. "Don't. I'm not asking you to forgive me." "Good. I watched you walking down the driveway holding her." Daniel's voice cracked. "I closed the door." Rachel looked away. "I don't know why I did it." "I do." He looked at her. "You thought you could." Daniel shut his eyes. Rachel continued. "You thought I had nowhere else to go. You thought I needed you more than you needed me. You thought that gave you permission." Daniel nodded. "I know. No, you know now." He started crying. Rachel had seen Daniel cry only twice before. At their wedding. And when Sophie was born, she didn't comfort him. He continued. "The next morning Hawthorne called. They wanted me to sign the final transfer agreement, and all I could see was Sophie crying." Rachel said nothing. "I realized if I did it, I was becoming exactly what my father thought I was." "You'd already become that." Daniel looked at her. "You're right." The investigation unfolded quickly after Daniel agreed to cooperate. Vanessa's flash drive contained recorded conversations, emails, financial transfers, and documents proving Hawthorne Capital had attempted to manipulate Bennett Holdings' internal governance. Daniel received no immunity. That mattered to Rachel. He had participated. He had committed financial misconduct. He had betrayed his father. And he had helped create the very danger he later tried to stop. Federal prosecutors eventually offered him a cooperation agreement. Daniel pleaded guilty to 2 financial offenses. He avoided a long prison sentence but received 18 months in federal custody, followed by supervised release, restitution, and a permanent restriction from serving as an officer of a publicly regulated investment entity. The conditional trust Arthur created was immediately terminated. Daniel would never receive the additional 20%. For the first time in his life, there was no inheritance waiting for him. No family name capable of erasing consequences. Before Daniel reported to prison, Rachel allowed him to spend one afternoon with Sophie. They met at a park in Connecticut. Sophie was too young to understand any of it. She ran toward Daniel. He picked her up and held her tightly. Rachel stood several feet away. Daniel carried Sophie toward the swings. They played for almost an hour. When it was time to leave, Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck. "No go." Daniel closed his eyes. Rachel felt something twist inside her. Not love for him. Not anymore. But grief for what their family could have been. Daniel put Sophie down. She ran toward Rachel. Daniel looked at his wife. "You could have destroyed me." Rachel stared at him. "You did that yourself." He nodded. "I know." Rachel remembered Arthur's second letter. Power is being able to hurt someone and choosing not to. "I didn't protect you, Daniel." "I know. I told the truth." "I know. I just didn't ask for more pain than the truth required." Daniel swallowed. "My father would be proud of you." Rachel looked away. "I wish he were here." "So do I." Daniel went to prison the following morning. The Hawthorne case became national financial news. Richard Hawthorne was indicted. Several executives resigned. Bennett Holdings' stock value initially dropped sharply. Analysts predicted chaos. Rachel's critics said Arthur had made a catastrophic mistake leaving control to someone with no corporate leadership experience. Rachel refused television interviews. She went to work. Marcus remained chief financial officer. Robert Keller was cleared after forensic investigators confirmed Vanessa had accessed his email. Rachel apologized to him personally. He stayed. They stabilized Bennett Logistics. They rejected Hawthorne's attempted acquisition. They restructured the board. They implemented internal controls Arthur had neglected because he trusted too few people and monitored too much himself. Rachel learned quickly. She made mistakes. Some expensive. She admitted them. That shocked people more than anything. One afternoon she approved an expansion plan that Marcus strongly opposed. The project lost nearly $12 million in 9 months. Rachel called an emergency board meeting. Everyone expected excuses. Rachel stood. "I was wrong." Silence. Marcus looked at her. Rachel continued. "I ignored objections because I wanted the plan to work. That's not leadership." After the meeting, Marcus said, "Do you know how rare that is?" "What?" "A billionaire saying she was wrong." Rachel smiled. "I'm not good enough at being a billionaire yet." Marcus laughed. "Stay that way." The divorce finalized while Daniel was incarcerated. Rachel requested no additional financial settlement beyond what was already legally hers. She maintained Daniel's access to Sophie through approved visits. Some of her friends didn't understand. Claire asked, "After everything he did?" Rachel looked at her. "I'm not giving him access to me." She glanced toward Sophie playing with blocks. "I'm allowing my daughter to know her father if he becomes someone safe enough to know. Do you think he will?" "I don't know." And Rachel meant it. Real life did not promise redemption simply because someone regretted their choices. Daniel would have to build it. Meanwhile, another mystery remained. The original missing page from Eleanor's ledger had never been found. Hawthorne possessed copies. Daniel possessed a copy. But Arthur's letter suggested the original mattered. Jonathan continued investigating. 8 months after Hawthorne's indictment, Mrs. Price called Rachel. "Come to the house." Rachel arrived that afternoon. Mrs. Price stood in Arthur's bedroom holding Eleanor's old jewelry box. "I found this behind the back panel." Inside was an envelope. Not blue, white. Eleanor's handwriting was on the front. "Arthur, if Charles ever tries to use the option." Rachel's heart pounded. Jonathan opened it in front of witnesses. Inside was the missing ledger page, and attached to it was a signed release from Charles Hawthorne dated 1996. The option had been legally terminated. Arthur had possessed proof the entire time. Rachel stared at Jonathan. "Then why didn't he use this?" Jonathan thought carefully. "Maybe he couldn't find it." Mrs. Price shook her head. "Arthur knew where Eleanor kept everything." Rachel frowned. Then she understood. Arthur had deliberately left the issue unresolved, not because he wanted chaos, because he wanted Daniel's choices to reveal themselves. Arthur knew Hawthorne's claim was worthless. But Daniel didn't. Arthur had allowed Daniel to believe Hawthorne had leverage. It was the final test, and Daniel had failed it. Rachel was angry. For days. She stood in Arthur's study holding the release. "You could have stopped all of this." No one answered. "You could have told him." Silence. Rachel looked at Arthur's photograph. Then she remembered something. Arthur had never promised to save Daniel from himself. He had spent decades trying. In the end, he had chosen to protect the company, Sophie, and thousands of employees from Daniel's decisions. Whether that was right or wrong became one of the few questions Rachel never fully resolved. 2 years passed. Daniel returned from prison quieter. He had lost weight. His first job application was rejected. Then the second. Then the second. Nobody cared that he had once been the presumed heir to Bennett Holdings. In fact, the name hurt him. Eventually, a small logistics firm in New Jersey hired him as an operations manager. He made $92,000 a year. For most Americans, it was a strong salary. For Daniel, it was less than he once spent annually on travel. He took the job. Rachel heard from Marcus. He starts Monday. Good. Aren't you curious? About? Whether he lasts. Rachel smiled. A little. Daniel lasted. He arrived early. Stayed late. He rented a modest apartment. He sold the sports car Arthur had bought him years earlier. He used part of the money to repay restitution. For Sophie's 3rd birthday, Daniel didn't buy an extravagant gift. He built her a dollhouse. Badly. One wall leaned slightly. Sophie loved it. Rachel watched Daniel sitting on the floor while Sophie placed tiny furniture inside. He looked up. I never knew Dad made things with his hands. Rachel smiled. He did. When? Before Bennett Holdings got big. Daniel nodded. I wish he'd told me. Rachel looked at him. He probably tried. Daniel laughed softly. Probably. They did not reconcile. That was important. Daniel changed. Rachel acknowledged it. But growth did not erase history. One evening after Sophie fell asleep, Daniel stood at Rachel's door. I'm different now. I know. I still love you. Rachel looked at him. I know. Is there any chance? Rachel was quiet. Then she shook her head. No. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Because of Vanessa? Because of me. He looked confused. Rachel continued. I spent years shaping myself around this marriage, trying to be quieter when you were stressed, more patient when you were absent, more understanding when I was lonely. She smiled sadly. I don't want to become that woman again. Daniel nodded. I understand. And I don't hate you. That somehow hurts more. Rachel laughed softly. Maybe that's part of growing up. Daniel smiled. At 40? Better late than never. He left. Rachel closed the door and felt peace. Not triumph. Peace. That surprised her. For years, Rachel imagined justice would feel loud, like revenge, like someone begging while she walked away. Instead, justice felt like being able to close a door without needing anyone on the other side to regret losing her. Bennett Holdings changed too. Rachel returned to the work she had cared about before marriage. She created a housing division focused on mixed-income development. Marcus warned her investors might hate it. Some did. Others loved it. The projects performed better than expected. She created expanded childcare benefits across Bennett properties, paid family leave, an emergency assistance program for employees facing eviction or domestic displacement. The initiative was personal. Rachel never explained publicly why. But the first time an employee used the program, Rachel read the anonymous case summary. A hotel housekeeper in Atlanta had been forced from her home with 2 children. The program placed them in temporary housing that same night. Rachel sat in her office staring at the report. She thought of herself barefoot on marble steps and cried. 3 years after Arthur's death, Bennett Holdings announced the Arthur and Eleanor Bennett Family Center in Queens. The center provided emergency housing, legal support, childcare, job placement, and financial counseling to women and families facing sudden displacement. At the opening ceremony, hundreds of people attended. Employees, community leaders, families, reporters. Daniel stood quietly near the back. No executive table. No reserved seat. He came as Sophie's father. Rachel stood near Arthur's portrait. A journalist approached. Mrs. Bennett, may I ask you something? Of course. People often describe your story as extraordinary. One night you lost your home. Less than 2 days later you discovered you'd inherited a multi-billion-dollar estate. Rachel smiled. That's one way of describing it. Did becoming wealthy change you? Rachel looked across the room. Mrs. Price was speaking with employees. Marcus stood beside Sophie. Daniel was helping his daughter open a juice box. Rachel remembered the cold marble beneath her bare feet. Vanessa wearing her robe. Daniel placing $200 on her suitcase. You'll figure it out. Then she remembered Arthur's handwriting. Never let money convince you to stay where love has already left. Yes, Rachel said. The journalist leaned closer. How? Rachel looked at her daughter. It taught me that losing a place where you're no longer loved isn't the same as losing everything. The journalist lowered her microphone. Rachel continued. For a long time I thought security meant having a husband, a beautiful home, money in the bank, and a family that looked perfect from the outside. She paused. But security isn't a house someone can lock you out of. Across the room, Daniel heard her. He lowered his eyes. Rachel wasn't trying to hurt him. That was the difference now. She didn't need revenge. She had built something better. The journalist asked, "What is security to you now?" Rachel looked at Sophie. Knowing who you are when everything you thought defined you disappears. The journalist smiled. Rachel continued. I didn't become strong because Arthur left me money. I became strong because one night I had almost nothing, and I still picked up my daughter and walked away. Later, after the ceremony, Rachel stood alone in front of Arthur's photograph. Daniel approached quietly. He'd be proud of you. Rachel smiled. He'd complain about how much the building cost. Daniel laughed. He'd complain first. Then tell everyone it was his idea. They both laughed. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Daniel looked at his father's photograph. I spent my entire life believing he didn't think I was good enough. Rachel listened. I thought inheriting the company would finally prove something. To him? Daniel shook his head. To me. Rachel looked at him. I hated you when he left it to you. I know. I thought you stole my life. Rachel remained silent. Daniel looked across the room at Sophie. But I think he was trying to give me one. Rachel felt tears forming. Daniel smiled sadly. I just couldn't see it. For the first time in years, Rachel touched his arm. Not as his wife. Not as the woman who wanted him back. As someone who had loved Arthur too. He loved you. Daniel swallowed. I know that now. Sophie came running toward them. Mommy! Rachel bent down and lifted her. Daniel smiled. I'll see you Saturday? Rachel nodded. 10 o'clock. I'll be there. Daniel started to leave. Then stopped. Rachel? Yes? I'm glad he chose you. Rachel stared at him. Daniel smiled. I wasn't for a long time. He looked toward Arthur's portrait. But I am now. Then he walked away. Rachel stood there holding Sophie. She realized she believed him. 5 years after the night Rachel was thrown out, Bennett Holdings was worth more than it had been when Arthur died. But Rachel rarely thought about that number. Her favorite measure of success came from a much smaller report. More than 7,000 families had received emergency support through programs created by the company. Thousands. Rachel kept one photograph in her office. Not of Arthur. Not of Daniel. Not even of Sophie. It was a photograph taken by a hotel security camera on the night Daniel threw her out. Rachel had obtained it during the divorce. In the image, she stood at the bottom of the driveway, wearing no shoes, holding Sophie in one arm and pulling the suitcase with the other. At first, Claire thought keeping it was strange. Why would you want to remember that? Rachel answered. Because sometimes I forget who saved me. Claire looked confused. Rachel smiled. I did. Years later, Rachel was invited to speak at a women's leadership event in Chicago. The moderator asked her what advice she would give someone staying in a relationship because she was financially dependent. Rachel answered carefully. Not everyone can simply walk away in one night. Sometimes leaving requires planning, support, legal help, money, and time. The room became quiet. But don't mistake difficulty for impossibility. She paused. And don't mistake dependency for worthlessness. Afterward, a woman approached Rachel privately. She was in her 50s. Her hands shook. "My husband has controlled every dollar for 28 years. Rachel listened. The woman continued. "I thought I was stupid for staying." Rachel shook her head. "No. I don't know where to start." Rachel took a card from her bag. "Start with one safe person," the woman cried. Rachel hugged her. That night in her hotel, Rachel called Sophie. "Mommy, when are you coming home?" "Tomorrow. Grandma Evelyn says I can have ice cream." Rachel laughed. "Mrs. Price is not your grandmother." Sophie shouted towards someone in the background. "She said she is." Rachel heard Mrs. Price calling, "I certainly am." Rachel laughed harder. Arthur would have loved it. A year later, Mrs. Price died peacefully in her sleep at 81. Rachel sat beside Daniel at the funeral. Sophie cried. Daniel held her. Afterward, they returned to Arthur's old estate. Rachel had kept it mostly unchanged. She walked into the kitchen. The same ridiculous espresso machine still sat on the counter. Daniel stared at it. Dad hated that thing. Rachel smiled. It was the first thing he ever talked to me about. Daniel pressed one of the buttons. The machine made an awful grinding noise. They both laughed. Then Daniel noticed an envelope tucked beneath the base. "What's that?" Rachel frowned. She pulled it out. Arthur's handwriting. "For whoever finally throws this awful machine away." Rachel laughed through tears. Daniel opened it. Inside was a single note. "If this machine outlived me, I have failed as a businessman." Rachel laughed so hard she had to sit down. Daniel laughed too. Sophie stared at them, as if adults made no sense. And perhaps that was Arthur's final gift. Not another secret. Not another test. Just laughter. Years after Rachel had inherited his empire, that small stupid note meant more to her than another $1 billion ever could. Because it reminded her that Arthur wasn't a legend. He wasn't only the billionaire whose will changed her life. He was family. And family, Rachel learned, was not always the person whose name you carried. Sometimes family was the person who saw your value before you could see it yourself. Sometimes family was the friend who gave you a couch, the housekeeper who became a grandmother, the executive who told you when you were wrong, the daughter who made you brave. And sometimes family was even the man who had once betrayed you, not because the marriage survived, but because he finally became the father your child deserved. Rachel never remarried quickly. People assumed she would. She didn't feel any urgency. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't waiting to be chosen. She chose. Her work, her daughter, her peace, her friends. Eventually, several years later, she met someone. His name was Michael Grant. He was a pediatric surgeon she met at a hospital fundraiser. He didn't know who she was at first. That amused Rachel. During dinner, he asked what she did. "I work in investment management." "What kind?" "A little bit of everything." Daniel later laughed when he heard, "A little bit of everything?" Rachel smiled. "I didn't want to lead with Billionaire." Michael took nearly a month to discover the truth. When he did, he called Rachel. "You own Bennett Holdings?" "Some of it." "Rachel. Most of it. You couldn't mention that? You didn't mention you were chief of pediatric surgery. That's on the hospital website. So is Bennett Holdings." Michael laughed. The relationship grew slowly. Rachel insisted on slowly. When Michael first met Sophie, he didn't bring an expensive present. He brought a children's book about space, because Rachel had mentioned Sophie loved stars. That mattered. Years earlier, Rachel might have wondered whether Arthur would approve of Michael. Now she realized Arthur had already taught her how to answer that question. Did this person make her smaller? Number. Did she have to beg for kindness? Number. Did love require her to abandon herself? No. That was enough. Daniel struggled when Rachel began dating seriously. He admitted it. "I know I don't have the right." "No. But it still hurts." "I know." Daniel looked at her. "Is he good to you?" Rachel smiled. "Yes." "Good." Then Daniel added, "If he isn't, I know people." Rachel stared at him. Daniel smiled. "Kidding. You went to federal prison. Exactly. I know people. Rachel burst out laughing. That was how far they had come. Not back to marriage. Forward to something healthier. At Sophie's 10th birthday, both men stood together trying to assemble an enormous telescope. Daniel read the instructions. Michael ignored them. Rachel watched from the kitchen. You two realize this is exactly how wars start. Daniel looked up. Tell your boyfriend he's doing it wrong. Michael corrected him. Fiancé. Daniel froze. Rachel froze too. Michael slowly turned. I was going to ask tonight. Sophie screamed. Daniel stared at Rachel. Then at Michael. Then started laughing. Well, congratulations on ruining your own proposal. Michael sighed. Rachel covered her face. Later that night, under the stars, Michael asked properly. Rachel said yes. Daniel attended the wedding. He sat beside Sophie. Arthur's chair remained empty in the front row with a photograph resting on it. When Rachel walked down the aisle, she looked at the picture. For one moment she imagined Arthur saying something sarcastic about the flowers being overpriced. She smiled. Michael took her hand. Rachel didn't think about the house she had lost. She didn't think about Vanessa. Or the courtrooms. Or inheritance. Or headlines. She thought about the woman she had been on that cold night. Barefoot. Terrified. Holding her daughter. Believing the future had just disappeared. She wished she could reach backward through time and whisper something to her. You have no idea what is waiting for you. Not the billions. Not the company. Something better. Yourself. And if Rachel's journey stayed with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Tale Vault for more powerful stories of betrayal, courage, second chances, hidden truths, and justice that arrives when people least expect it. And I want you to answer this in the comments. If you had been Rachel, would you have ever allowed Daniel back into your daughter's life after everything he did, or would that night on the front steps have been the end forever? Tell me what you think and tell me where you're watching from. Because perhaps the most important part of Rachel's story isn't that her billionaire father-in-law left her everything. It isn't that Daniel lost the company he thought belonged to him. It isn't that Hawthorne was exposed. It isn't even that Rachel eventually found love again. It's this. A closed door can make you believe you've lost everything. But sometimes you haven't been locked out of your future. Sometimes you've simply been released from your past. Daniel believed throwing Rachel out would make her powerless. He believed the house was security because his name controlled it. He believed money was power because he controlled the accounts. He believed Rachel needed him because she had left her career to raise their daughter. But Daniel had misunderstood the woman standing in front of him. And perhaps Rachel had misunderstood herself too. Arthur's inheritance gave Rachel resources. It gave her responsibility. It gave her opportunities most people could only imagine. But the billions had not carried her down those marble steps. Rachel had carried herself. The money had not held Sophie against her chest while she walked into the cold. Rachel had. The company had not told Daniel to keep his $200. Rachel had. Long before anyone told her she owned 52% of Bennett Holdings, Rachel had already made the most important decision of her life. She chose not to beg someone to love her. And years later, that remained the inheritance she valued most. Arthur gave her a company. He gave Sophie a future. But he also gave Rachel something no lawyer could ever list in a will. He reminded her of her worth at exactly the moment someone else tried to convince her she had none. And on certain winter nights, when the temperature dropped and Rachel heard the wind against her windows, she sometimes remembered those cold marble steps. She remembered how terrified she had been. Then she would walk into Sophie's room, pull the blanket higher around her daughter's shoulders, stand there for a moment, and smile. Because that night Daniel locked Rachel out of his house. But without realizing it, he opened the door to the rest of her life. And this time, Rachel knew exactly where she belonged.